knowledge and wisdom that is gained can be posted for our friends out there at #Kliks2. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin Khatimil Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Amma ba'd. Respected keynote speakers, directors, deputy directors, paper presenters, participants, and mutakallimun in general, welcome back to our second day. Yesterday, we had a big discussion on the problems facing us in the postmodern age. We had our honorable Shaykh, we had Shaykh FARUQ discussing the problems that we face for centuries, dealing with issues that plague us, and we were confronted with the dilemma of whether we even wanted to deal with this problem. Our great scholars, such as Ibn Sina, had the courage to deal with problems that made him receive blames for centuries until today. And are we the people that can take on this challenge despite the blame that will be put upon us for daring to deal with philosophy and things that certain quarters of the Muslim world has deemed as something un-Islamic, and even to the point of deviance? Sheikh FOUDEH had enlightened us on all the problems that the postmodern crisis stemmed from. He mentioned many philosophers in the West that had gained their knowledge from the classical philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, and from then on, we developed modern philosophy at the hands of Kant, at the hands of Hume, and many more. And these are the challenges facing you today. And you are equipped with the material. As we know, as I witnessed, as I enjoyed the discourse that was happening yesterday, as a student of the 1990s, I did not have the equipment that you have today, the students of today in Malaysia, who are well versed in Bahasa Malaysia, English, and Arabic. And you are very much aware of our tradition. I was trained in New York City, in Columbia University, and I indeed was taught Thomas Aquinas before Imam Al-Ghazali. With my first experience with Thomas Aquinas, I thought I felt Islam in it, and I was deeply confused. I was deeply questioning, was he Muslim? And I was not aware of Imam Al-Ghazali. So you had the fortune today as students being in close encounter with everything. So inshallah, this course today will enlighten you further in order to be our warriors, intellectual warriors for the future. And to end yesterday's discourse, we had Sheikh Dr. Khalid Zahri, who discussed Kalam manuscript, and even the polemic that was involved between the Nasrani and the Yahudi with the Muslim. So we continue today with our theme, Kalam's approach to key issues driven by postmodern challenges. And today, let me introduce you to someone who does not need any introduction, Sheikh Dr. HAKIM MURAD from the UK. He will present his topic, Muslim Intellectuality and Moral Decline. A bit of a biography: Sheikh Dr. HAKIM MURAD is the Dean of Cambridge Muslim College, Director of Studies at Wolston College in the area of Theology and Religious Studies, as well as the Sheikh SAEED Lecturer in Islamic Studies at Cambridge University. He is the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Classical Islamic Theology in 2008, and author of Bombing Without Moonlight, and a contributor to BBC Radio 4 Thought for the Day. Tafaddal, Sheikh.
وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. I just wanted to offer some reflections on the, I think, emphatically Ghazalian idea of the human embeddedness of philosophical choices and the way in which this inevitably opens up in our contemporary context and our supposedly postmodern context some questions that are actually quite classical to do with ego and self-control. I say Ghazalian because although we admiringly and in many ways quite worriedly think about the tight compartmentalization of his Sufi and Kalam epistemologies, separated out so forensically in the Iqtisad and his Minhaj al-Abidin, we have not sufficiently reflected on the way in which his final dismissal of the Avicennan project, with its point-by-point philosophical rebuttal of philosophical fallacies, begins with a spiritual diagnosis. He laments the way, and this is a neglected part of the Tahafut, but it is, in a sense, the key to all that follows. He laments the way in which religious indifferentism of many falasifa is rooted in a rejection of religious taqlid generated by another kind of taqlid. The falasifa, or at least Ghazali's contemporaries, students of Farabi and Ibn Sina, have been intoxicated by high-sounding names and by the show and status of the Arabized reception of the late antique symphony of Plato and Aristotle. It is ego, the Imam insists, that has led them to make their disastrously mistaken theory choices, rather than the intrinsic coherence of falsafa dialectics. The Kalam fight back against key falsafa masail, which follows Ghazali's Tahafut as its undoubted flagship, begins in his first muqaddimah with a diagnosis which is powerfully psychological and ethical. This pathologizing of a mistaken ratio recalls Foucault's famous seminar at the Collège de France, in which he dissects what he calls spirituality as the historic propedeutic to philosophy. Western thought began with the Delphic know thyself, and all previous generations of thinkers launched their philosophical lives in the context of a socially and institutionally mandated culture of self-knowledge and self-denial, so that the human subject would embark on its philosophical journey unencumbered by ego. This is emblematic of what we've come to call the late Foucault, a concern with the genealogy of our modern conceptions. It is, I suppose, a sort of phenomenology, but the epoché, the bracketing out required here, is not a Husserlian bracketing out of worldview, but of something deeper and more elemental, self itself. Foucault notes and almost proposes as a definer of our late modernity the pursuit of a philosophical project in a discursive, social and academic space which almost uniquely in history has allowed the discipline of self-abnegation to lapse, or at least to be thoroughly privatized. This was one of Foucault's late concerns. He found himself deeply dissatisfied with the way in which subjectivity was cultivated in the France of his time. Almost like Ghazali, he was, in the words of Paul Rabinov, on an increasingly articulate and acute quest for a form that would constitute a difference between what Foucault diagnosed as an impoverished modern problem space and a future in which things might be different and better. One might say that for Ghazali, like Foucault, philosophy chases its own tail unless the human subject is in some way delivered from its own vulgar reflexivity. In his famous period of doubt, in which even the viability of first-order propositions seemed to be fragile, the Imam nonetheless had access to a Khurasanian world of psychomacy and its masters, which, as he records, reinstated his access not only to God, but to the use of nazar. The late Foucault's unease about his thought environment was well placed, if slightly belated, but the cafes and bathhouses of his arrondissement could not provide the murshid who could open the way to a truly different mode of knowing. This insistence is, we might say, not parochial, but effectively universal. The basic religious commandment to know oneself is the foundation for intellectuality as it is for all else. World religions seem to converge on the understanding that the human creature contains not one but two selves. The first is the lower, passional, fallacious self, which Latin calls anima, and which is nafs in Arabic, nefesh in Hebrew, vedana in Sanskrit, while the second is spiritus, ruh, roach, or atman. The latter is not conditioned by time or space. We hence have no empirical experience of it. Liberation, or intellectual probity, is not about shaking off the physical body oneself is not so easily escaped, but of shaking off all bodies insofar as these are subject to the world's gravity. The choice of the religious thinker is therefore between ourselves as we are in ourselves and to others, and ourselves as we are in God. Correct philosophy is thus rooted in a pre-rational, non-discursive relationship between ruh and nafs, which is hostile, adversarial. Everything which is subject to uncontrolled wants of any kind must be left behind. So Rumi writes of his sage, he has died to self and become alive through the Lord. Theology thus begins with a kind of coming to life, the life that is death to the self. Christian philosophers used to quote the passage in Luke's Gospel which holds that no one can be a disciple until he hate his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters. Meister Eckhart writes, as long as thou still knowest who thy father and mother have been in time, thou art not dead with the real death. In the context of our Ishmaelite religion, this absoluteness is not expressed in this way, of course, as Christian styles of monastic withdrawal from property and family, considered necessary by medieval European thinkers, were replaced by the prophetic model of what came to be known as al-khalwa fil jalwa. The Muslim theologian inhabits the heart of his society. Still, the Ghazalian, and therefore the later Sunni insistence, remains on the death of self, because of the metaphysical understanding of the categoric otherness of the real. The hadith says, whatever occurs to your mind, know that God is other than that. Kalam apophaticism, in a sense, mirrors the self-denial which is already there in the theologian's soul. Perhaps it helps to remember a parallel to this distinctly unmodern perspective in the arts. Traditional sacred art typically ignored the artist or the craftsman. Anonymity, namelessness, is the quality of the Muslim who has naughted the self, and therefore the artist who provides guidance through his art will typically not even include his own name. Just as scripture is truly God's, the personality of the human bearer having been eliminated, so sacred art is only authentic when the human bridge vanishes. So the art historian, Harold Swartzensky, observes, it is in the very nature of medieval art that extremely few names of artists have been transmitted to us. The entire mania of connecting the few names preserved by tradition with well-known masterpieces, all this is characteristic of the 19th century's cult of individualism based upon ideals of the Renaissance. And although, of course, in our Kalam tradition there are names to conjure with the exegetic accumulation, the names become little more than figures, and it is the tradition itself and its discursive accumulation of commentary and super-commentary that becomes the center of our attention. Ghazali's contextualizing of Kalam within a broader religious and frankly spiritual system of moral and mental discipline thus ensures that for his theological vision the principle of self-knowledge and self-control is the first and necessary propedeutic. The word aql itself originally signified restraint, the hobbling of a beast, the first thing you need to do to it, to be able to control it. The discipline of Sufism emerged in part to provide formal mechanisms for the restraint of the beast of the ego, and Ghazali saw clearly how necessary this was for the performance of any objective theory choice in Nazar. Primal Islam had launched an integrative human project which united bodily functions through consciously practiced and assessed purity laws and rituals with social relations, political and economic life, formal worship, and the gifts of the spirit. As Ghazali reminded his generation, the purpose of every form of the revealed law was to uplift humanity by the remembrance of God. And this reminder, this dhikr, required a consciousness that was seen to be inseparable from the project of systematic theology. In the Ghazalian perspective, everything is theology. The Sufi tradition is in this sense the integrative point of departure for Nazar, whose great practitioners have always been advocates of Sufism of some kind. Of itself, Kalam, and also fiqh, cannot supply the processes of mental discipline necessary to its right pursuit. A syllogism may deliver ilzam correctly even in the hands of a villain. But there are many philosophical decisions to be made that rely on more human rather than purely computational dialectical processes. And Sufism can, as Sunni Islam generally concurred, manage to guide and save souls without the help of kalam, whereas kalam will never guide and save unless its practitioners have passed through the refiner's fire of self-naughting. This is why Maulana Rumi says in Book 5 of his Masnavi, self-existence brings terrible drunkenness. It removes intellect from the head and modesty from the heart. Lying in ambush, the intoxication of self-existence has waylaid 100,000 prior generations. Through it, a servant like Azazil became Iblis, saying, "Why should Adam be Lord over me?" It's almost talking about the modern academic environment. This drunkenness, supplied by the self, or the ego, which destroys both intellectuality and ethics, is here prefigured by Azazil's disobedience to the divine command to bow down before the creature that was made of clay. He offers a syllogistic argument, a classical piece of sophistry to show God the error of his judgment. I am better than him. You've created me of fire and him of clay. Why does he use this Jadali response? Because, Rumi says, of his ego, or perhaps what Foucault would see as the form of his thought world. Unrefined, he reaches for an improper philosophical case for obeying his own pride and fiery nature. It is not syllogistics which are at fault, but their improper deployment by he who aba was takbara, who refused and was vainglorious. What to do in the absence of a culture of self-naughting? Much philosophy today inclines to the alternative sort of grounding in community experience. Here, for instance, is Martha Nussbaum. Anglo-American moral philosophy is turning from an ethics based on Enlightenment ideals of universality to an ethics based on tradition and particularity, from an ethics based on principles to an ethics based on virtue, from an ethics dedicated to the elaboration of systematic theoretical justifications to an ethics suspicious of theory and respectful of local wisdom, from an ethics based on the isolated individual to an ethics based on affiliation and care, from an ahistorical, detached ethics to an ethics rooted in concreteness and history. The implications of this recent Western turn for Muslim theology are considerable and in many ways benign. Orientalism, of course, cannot use it. Aaron Hughes and other secular fundamentalists will cry out in pain when told that their insistence on a view from nowhere for a deliberate exclusion of one's own locatedness from the scholarly process is old-fashioned, and the apparently older religionists' insistence on pursuing academic theology within the template of a thought community in fact turns out to be better suited to the West's current secular mood. In fact, we might even be tempted to insist that religionists are better equipped to pursue rigorous scholarship, since, unlike their atheistic colleagues, their theory choices are, at least in principle, purified by a personal habit of self-knowledge, humility, and what our Imam would call muhasaba. This is one important implication of Foucault's moment of disillusion with Sorbonne philosophizing. Muslims would probably be tempted to step even further, using something like Charles Taylor's insistence that we cannot, in fact, manage without the process of the moral, since the human subject cannot be said to exist without its evaluative functions. Taylor writes this: "This is not meant just as a contingently true psychological fact about human beings, which could perhaps turn out one day not to hold for some exceptional individual or new type, some superman of disengaged objectification. Rather, the claim is that living within such strongly qualified horizons is constitutive of human agency, that stepping outside these limits would be tantamount to stepping outside what we recognize as integral, that is, undamaged human personhood. So there is no view from nowhere if we remain human thinkers and scholars, for not only is our belongingness to ummah and to madhab and to region and language part of what we are, it in fact supplies the only viable basis for assessing the meaning of things. Without it, Taylor says, there could only be meltdown." And we might add that in the context of the modern ummah, without true belongingness to the set of moral horizons supplied by membership of fixed madhabs and the religious community as a whole, with stable local urf instantiations which frame the believer's moral universe, a psychic collapse would necessarily ensue. And indeed, this seems to be what increasingly we witness as the destruction of the former mental ecosystems in the Middle East trigger the emergence of excruciating and desperate pathologies of violence. Out of the water, a fish thrashes around. Certainly, it cannot do good theology. Islamic muhasaba might seem at first blush a simple variant on earlier discourses of self-naughting and moral community. Of course, the ego does not change any more than truth does. Aristotle's list of virtues and vices were not difficult to incorporate into formal Islamic ethics, any more than were, say, the Ten Commandments, if we accept the necessarily parochial case of Sabbath observance. But although Abraham's transcending of his own emotions at the binding of his son is a moment shared in principle by the three ways of the one, the three Abrahamic monotheisms, he binds for our memory in specifically Ishmaelite mode. What is it historically and metabolically that characterizes this Ishmaelite modality of God talk? Into an already highly conflicted world of Old and New Covenant, letter and spirit, synagogue and church, Islam, the path of Ishmael, intrudes in the 7th century as a new significant other, finally giving sense, it seemed, to the tale of Abraham's banishment of Ishmael and shaping European Christian selves and peoples into further reactive identities as non-Islamic, which will endure and prove their power even in core nationalist narratives of the 19th and 20th century, and even in some cases today. The rest of Europe's defining tensions seem to be binary. Reason in its engagement with revelation, the autochthonous intention with the Christian, Roman universalism in tension with local monarchies, but the relation between our monotheisms has, since the rise of Islam, been intensely and distinctively tripolar. Hence then, one might propose a neologism. All else that delivers European Western syntheses of the kind that philosophically today we have to engage with has been dialectical, but Hegel is transcended and even confounded by the addition in the 7th century of the Muslim other, so that perhaps we could use the term trialectic to fit this case. Europe has had not one but two consistent alterities. Christianity and its own theological sense of self has been shaped by its engagement with both, and they have both in turn had their periods of being shaped by it. As Christian theology reaches its Thomist climax, it both learns from but also emotionally brackets out both the two Semitisms which precede and succeeded, the rabbis, going back to Philo, and the Saracens, of whom Al-Ghazali is a significant, though for them Avicenized, exemplar. This trialectic might attempt engagement and find its outcomes by focusing on externals of ritual, of purity laws which patrol boundaries, and of other societal norms. But Abraham's three major sacralities all self-define as monotheistic, which is to say that their final form is taken to be not a form of life, but an idea. While the importance of theology has not been at all equal in these traditions, their engagement will most essentially invoke the realm of the abstract and conceptual. Monotheisms, unlike, for instance, most forms of traditional Hindu or Chinese religion, share the innovations of the period which Karl Jaspers called the axial age. Our theologies tend to emphasize the individual and individual accountability. They are, as we've seen, intensely ethics-oriented, even as a preface to the entire theological enterprise. And although they maintain rituals, human intentionality in those rituals becomes all-important. The axial age generated universal religious cultures through the act of turning within and self-scrutiny. Despite such apparently shared assumptions and the ability of such traditions to discuss abstractions and universals, they are also susceptible, of course, to the development of a mutual allergy, as the only God is habitually jealous of all others, including rival definitions of him. And this intersubjectivity of the monotheisms and their relationship to pagan antiquity which preceded them has done much to occlude the process of self-naughting and the transcendence of vainglory, which is the point with which we began. In the context of Kalam, the systematics of the final and decisive Abrahamic intellectuality, the accumulation of earlier paradigms militated against a simple dichotomizing between self and other. The interlocutors, dead but also alive, were simply too diverse in the cosmopolitan milieu of Baghdad and Khorasan, in which Kalam had its crucible. Unlike modern Western philosophy, which dialogues only with itself, or perhaps sometimes with the natural sciences, and unlike Christian scholasticism with its titanic struggle in Aquinas' time with Latin Averroism, Kalam faces many ways simultaneously, like Baghdad itself. Its polemics seriously entertain propositions from the diversity taxonomized, say, in Shahrastani's Milal wa Nihal. Refutation was needed not only of Aristotelian denials of creation, but also of various Christian incarnationisms, of Judaic denials of continuous prophecy and the possibility of post-Mosaic abrogation, and also Brahmanical and Buddhistic denials of prophecy itself. Kalam is intensely multiple in its focuses. This non-dichotomizing legacy may be seen as a paradigmatic challenge to the modern impasse in epistemology, which has resulted in the postmodern crisis of our culture, which comes about as a disillusion with over-reified dichotomies and binaries. 2 always implies dichotomy. 3 or more makes dichotomy less obvious and may open the possibility of mediation. Islam is part of the Abrahamic ternary, but has its optic focus to include antiquity and India as well. For Emmanuel Levinas, our culture must urgently retreat from the besetting sin of Europe, which he identifies as the tendency driven by ancient chauvinisms, Greek binaries, and early modern science to reify others as others, to be characterized and thereby controlled. For him, it is the mutual regard of the Christian and the Jewish, that was his context, which has been the most tragic paradigm, a rancorous pas de deux of ceaseless rivalry and contumacy, born of the belief that exegesis had attained a full definition and reduction in this binary opposition. The theologian's self-discipline must be ennobled by a non-binary relationality, however. For others, such as the gender alert, such as Lacan and Irigaray, and again here we see in gender studies this besetting European sin of the them and the us, the same and the other, a binary reduction. The most tragic of all binaries, in effect, born of knowledge of the other and the will to power, has been the male and the female. So much more theorizing about the dichotomizing tendencies of Western thought has been done at the hands of gender alert thinkers. So whereas for Levinas, our besetting misfortune in Western intellectual culture has been the alleged basis of the letter-spirit dichotomy, for feminists, it's been supplied by our response to the 2 modalities of gender. Both seem to force a dialectic whereby the other is either reduced to an alternative to the self, which was the Enlightenment project, or for the postmoderns affirmed as unknowable alterity. Attempts to overcome such binaries are legion. Most recently, for instance, they would include Daniel Boyarin's essay on Christianity as being not really different or an opposition to Judaism, but as a variant of it. And also some of the recent gender theories which seek to challenge gender essences and propose a single human continuum lived in endless flux and renegotiation. Much of the West's current conversation is about breaking down that male-female dichotomy in favor of an individualistic set of forensic choices. In most such attempts, however, the resolution is sought either by turning the dialectic to new ends, so an old zero-sum game is just replaced by a new one, or by deconstructing its terms, or by reconstructing an ethical polemic such as, for instance, women against patriarchy. Very seldom is the possibility of opening it up to something non-dialectical, to our trialectic, or something even more plural, with further antipathies entertained. Western thought remains trapped in the logic of 2, of equivalencies or polarities. Could it be that the current disrespect into which current serious academic theology has fallen is due in part to this sense that under modern epistemological and plural conditions, the most convincing work is likely to be intuitive and unsystematic. An opportunistic exploiting of slippery convergences and epiphanies of intuitive recognition that may resemble the odd closeness which can appear between words and idioms in different languages. And this is the alternate, as it were, romanticizing alternative to the Kantian dialectics, which appears with Schleiermacher and a lot of other Christian theologians, that we break down this fierce, computational, reductionist approach through using something more affective. So in the context of Islamic studies, you might think of somebody like Louis Massignon, whose grasp of Islam was in many ways unrivaled, the greatest of the mustashriqeen, but actually based on a theology whereby he set up a juxtaposition between Islam and its Christian other, which seems to have been very unsystematic, informal, intuitive, even unscholarly, marked by a substantial reliance on informal types of non-verbal human solidarity and recognition during things like table fellowship, informal soirees, and joint pilgrimages of various kinds. Learning here becomes affective as well as factual. His conviction was that when religionists set aside the theories and their egos and consult their own deep intuition, they will find a self-verifying experience that communication is indeed possible, that one can transcend the logic of the same and the other. And although he refused to propose any kind of detailed theology of the kind that perhaps Kalam would want to account for this, possibly due to the inhibitions inherent in his pre-conciliar Catholic world, his entire work is grounded in the assumption of its feasibility. Massignon's conclusion was that a deep theologizing experienced in joint interfaith pilgrimages, for instance, or in the sharing of scriptural texts, or in the investigation of symbolically rich and archetypal ideal figures, such as Al-Hallaj, can indeed be made academically public, the facilitator being the disciplined transcending of the ego and the insistence on ethical priorities and the recognition of the humanity of the other. The strength of this argument, still to some extent, I think has persuasive force, although mainstream Islamic studies still very much hesitates over the purposes of his major writings, which are seen as confessional or even mystical. In a religious world in which stasis and fixed positions have become the exception, our mobility, while part of the postmodern condition, seems often to confirm as well as to confound our ability to understand. The further horizon has also recently been opened to us. Not a few Muslims have sought to return to the ethical and self-aware principle in theology by entering the enterprise known as scriptural reasoning. The origins of this lie with post-Holocaust interrogations of liberal reason that found an inspiration in a return to styles of exposition that seemed able to yield an apparently fortuitous wisdom which promised an ethical outcome characterized by empathy rather than by dogmatic finality. People like David Novak and Peter Oakes have been among the pioneers of the more academic wing of this movement. Peter Oakes' work on pragmatism of the American philosopher Charles Peirce, providing the earliest and to date probably most comprehensive philosophical foundation for the project, and Jewish, Christian and also Muslim theologians have found considerable energizing force in this. If you look at the online Journal of Scriptural Reasoning, you'll see there's a good number of Muslim theologians who are now publishing in that matrix. For Oakes, pragmatism, understood as an essentially introspective, self-knowing assessment of truth claims with an eye to their human entailments, helpfully acknowledges the force of positivism while not discounting metaphysics altogether. Despite Peirce's basically Victorian intellectual milieu, his approach to the logic of relations appears to speak directly to our contemporary needs, which are, to quote Oakes, a concern to find reasonably precise ways of talking about imprecise things without losing the meaning of the imprecision itself. A belief that phenomena of everyday language, including the everyday practices of religion, are among those things. A love of critical reasoning, but an acquired distrust of criticism that has lost sense of having a purpose. Disillusionment with modern, or Enlightenment attempts to make a metaphysics and also a religion out of the rational critique of inherited traditions of knowledge and practice. A conviction that post-Enlightenment anti-rationalism, including romanticisms, emotivisms, and a variety of totalizing ideologies of power, history, experience, and so on, may prove logically to be the other side of the rationalist coin. Fascination with the irrevocable contextuality, temporal, historical, linguistic, social, biological, of rational judgments, but also with their persistent rationality. Although many Muslims are not comfortable with the exercise, for such thinkers of Muslim background, this scriptural reasoning enterprise seems to offer a new horizon of kalam knowing. The currently regnant alternatives of a simple foundationist hermeneutic that too easily collapses into implicit or explicit fundamentalism, or a Derridean deconstruction of Quran and Hadith which negates any characterization of the religion or its claims, are desolating. The Islamic world is seen as requiring a hermeneutic which accounts for the integrity of the text and recurrent patterns of interpretation, while conceding the impossibility of closure. The fundamentalist movements, currently so regnant in a Muslim world traumatized and unvalued by the identity crisis which we referred to earlier, are allergic to any type of provisionality. But the recentness of their determination to transform all of the zanni into the qat'i has been amply shown by Thomas Bauer in his recent book, The Culture of Ambiguity. Resistance to a culture of closure is in fact normative in Sunni Islam, beginning its decline, as he shows, only in the mid-19th century, a time when anxious Muslims sought clear and final answers in a new and hostile context, which they found profoundly threatening. There's another term which we might be able to repristinate here. A key element of much classical reflection on Islamic theology, which is ultimately an exercise in systematic scriptural exegesis, is described under the heading of futuwa, chivalry, denoting an ethos of extreme altruism in the inner jihad. Defined by John Renard as the substructure of Islam's spiritual path, its adherents, including its most salient thinker, Shihabuddin Omar Suhrawardi, dies in 1234, believe, and this is from Suhrawardi, if someone insults you, you should pray for him. If someone deprives you of something, give him something when he is in need. If someone severs his ties with you, adhere to him faithfully and never desert him. This is the true chivalry and manliness and the essence of God's word, the Quran. Suhrawardi's tradition, even though institutionally and conceptually at some distance from the Kalam, came to establish houses of chivalry in which this type of piety could be cultivated. The Quran's legalities and plain sense were not to be circumvented, problematized, or abolished, but should be subject to a hermeneutic which understands the book's purpose, which is to spread love. The Quran is the narrative of a human divine romance, so that Shamsi Tabriz calls it the Ishq-Nameh, the book of passion. A merely legal or philosophical eye will thus fail to do it justice and will reduce it to the genre of either law book or dogmatic monograph. Kalam without futuwa, in our holistic Ghazalian vision, will degenerate into doxological polemic. It's always been the besetting risk, the occupational hazard of doing Kalam, doxological polemic. However, a chivalric second reading of the text, driven by this understanding of a meta-context of divine compassion, allowed the houses of chivalry to search for lenient or concessory, wisdom-oriented interpretations of scriptural passages in order to avert what they believed to be an unintended strictness abhorrent to the divine purpose. One should only take fatwa from a master of futuwa, they used to say. Erudition is essential but insufficient to interpret the text and do theology according to the higher canon of mercy, of rahmah. This differs significantly from more standard fiqh discussions of rukhsa and azima, concession and strict application, which revolve around considerations of public interest, maslahah. Such an approach is not, properly speaking, a second reading, but a ameliorative first reading, since its perspective is essentially mundane and utilitarian. Despite its rootedness in classical Sharia theories of the discernibility of the divine purpose, its potential empowering of transparently subjective interpretations is evident. Futuwa seems close to pragmatist, ethical understandings of charitable rereading in its unsystematic anticipation of unexpected convergences and possibilities. Given what we've said about the future of Kalam as necessarily receptive to an awareness of the givenness of the theologian and the need for theory choices directed by an ethical soul, this principle seems a good category in which to frame our demand for a spiritual prelude to the theological quest. For the various Muslim thinkers who have shown increasing interest in the Persian turn, internal Islamic reifications in danger of collapse at the hands of rival Muslim interpretations may be evaluated by their sustainability in the context of Abrahamic collegiality, thus permitting a sort of return to the old culture of a welcome ambiguity. For Muslim hermeneutes, the Quranic context is believed to be particularly hospitable to a Persian pragmatism, given the profound ethicism and teleological thrust of the Quran itself. Ethical delivery and coherence towards other Muslim theologians and the monotheistic other allow one to recommence, but never conclude, the process of defining the normative, as in the Quran itself, Muslimness is partly to be figured as a complex response to a plurality of other paradigms. This possible retrieval of the older kalam and fiqh culture of permissible ambiguity and openness seems facilitated by the principle, which I alluded to earlier briefly, of the shared Semitic. There is perhaps something categoric, a final closure, implied by the Christian soteriology which Islam and Judaism have not been comfortable with. Yet Jakob Neusner's view that Islam and Judaism are integrally cognate types of religion is not uncontested. Notably, in its stark contrast, there is a tradition from Nietzsche and his followers, which seems effectively to exclude Islam from the category of the Semitic, on the grounds that Islam, with its will to power, challenges the Semitic passivity and negativity which he thought was entailed in Jewish myths of the fall, in favour of an affirmation of the life principle. Where the Semitic appears receptive and feminine, its Promethean antithesis is active and male. Carlyle's very virile prophetess hero seems hewn from this vein, and the race theory of Sigrid Honka is in some respects even more insistent. Jesus, on this view, is not really a man, he's an androgyne. Without hormones, he is inhuman, and this sickly detachment from body and world has denied man the fullness of life. In fact, for Nietzsche, Christianity, far from being a Greek and hence Aryan antithesis for the Semitic, a good foundation for a solid philosophical project, ironically partakes of a Judaic weakness, which it expresses in the particular form of celibacy and gospel pacifism, while Islam is an affirmative Semitic religion, or even more, a paragon of life-affirming values. That's Ian Alman's characterization. In his Antichrist, we learn that, this is Nietzsche, Christianity robbed us of the harvest of the culture of the ancient world. It later went on to rob us of the harvest of the culture of Islam. The wonderful Moorish cultural world of Spain, more closely related to us at bottom, speaking more directly to our senses and taste than Greece and Rome, was trampled down. Why? Because it had to thank noble and manly instincts for its origin, because it said yes to life, even to the rare and refined luxuriousness of Moorish life. The Crusades later made war on something before which it would have been even more fitting for them to have grovelled in the dust, a civilization beside which even that of our 19th century seems very poor and very senile. Christianity, on such a view, therefore, seems hardly capable of maintaining the kind of virile yet egoless ethical culture which Nietzsche sees as indispensable to proper philosophical work. Still, consider the rabbinical thinker Joseph Soloveitchik and his idea of the festive dignity of the man who is conformed faithfully to the details of a revealed law. This idea of the festive dignity of the jurist, and hence the theologian, his basic form of life, doesn't seem alien to the culture of the alim and his thesis of a legal recognition that one knows God through the practice of the details of his law.
The joyful recognition of God in a world made richly meaningful by his detailed commandments does, I would suggest, find a very real echo in Islamic piety. This is the case on the affective level, but other convergences to be reckoned with also, not least the significance of cognate languages with paradigmatically Hebrew and Arabic scriptures and terms which are both taken to be rooted in verbatim expressions of divine speech and which underline classically Jewish and Islamic theology and philosophy in a way which Christian theologians could not know. Mind, disconnected from body and culture, ends in deconstruction. Body, disconnected from mind, becomes perverse, smeared and twisted by something like some contemporary artists, Lucian Freud, smeared, distorted, perverted. The disconnection betrays sibling turns, that of Leibniz, who opened the doors to abolishing the function of the exterior world, and that of Locke, who anticipated more physicalist neuroscientists by emphasizing the mind's passivity. Neo-Kantians strove to overcome this gulf. But Muslim theism, Kalam, which has found it hard to sustain a mind-body dualism, has often sought to overcome it through reference not so much to rationality as such, aql, nazar, but as we've seen in this Ghazalian sense, the propedeutic of self-knowledge to a pre-rational intuition, the fitra, which allows us to link the mind directly to objects. The instrumentalizing of this link is the revealed law, Sharia, which begins with elementary bodily functions and ramifies into every dimension of life. Thus, the reality of the world is affirmed, the world is for us, but also its heterogeneity. Difference is real and to be affirmed because we know that the world merits different forms of Sharia access and address. The Sharia being our means of affirming the sacrality, the sign-like nature of the forms of creation. This body-world relation, which is the Sunnah, might well be seen as a sophisticated expression of what the philosopher Michael Bakhtin calls architectonics. For Bakhtin, in his critique of Western instrumental reason, the Enlightenment had not offered an adequate account of the manner by which we may negotiate the hiatus between perception of the self and perception of external entities. We see others from our own horizon, but radically homogenize them within a generic category of others. What is required is a mode of perception which obliges us to ground our perception of others in an awareness of their own mutual separation and distinctiveness. This in turn requires a proper acknowledgement of our own situatedness, particularly of our characteristic enfleshment within human bodies. Bakhtin's notion of architectonics appears to contribute to our vocabulary for a positive theistic critique of the larger weaknesses of Enlightenment reason, which nonetheless does open the way for the styles of a contemporary Kalam, with its backdrop in spirituality and in a style of the spiritualization of the body. It seems to require not only an affirmation of the integrity of the other's act, but also a political act by the self to serve the other. The other is detected and valued through architectonic apprehension and must be actively defended. Every human being has an innate right. Here Bakhtin is far from Heidegger, who shared his strong sense of the defeat of scientific optimism during the Great War, but whose system seemed to valorize an affirmation of selfhood through the mere fact of decision-taking. So that, as Karl Jaspers described Heidegger's position, the manner of thinking was more important than the content of political judgments. Dangerous. Bakhtin offers a system that seems to be much more congenial to a Kalam perspective, making this kind of idolatry of the will much more difficult, and returning us perhaps to the Ghazalian insistence on the epistemological primacy of the ethical. Similarly committed to social and political activism grounded in a rejection of dualism is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. There's been a revival of interest amongst philosophers in Merleau-Ponty's work in the last few years. Like Bakhtin, he appreciates the contemporary concern with self-awareness and wishes to affirm its bodily quality. His concept of the body subject seeks to defeat Enlightenment dualism without conceding any ground to behaviorism. Body and mind are not a composite of two principles, one of which is simply a part of a material network of causality, while the other, incarnated somehow within it, comprises a sovereign but moral agent of perception. Instead, the body subject is a single entity with the self existing as the highest modality of the fully integrated phenomenon that is the body subject. The spiritual is real and is not reducible simply to the physical. Nonetheless, it is an aspect of it. Without the body, we do not exist. This kind of body-mind integration, so congenial to, as it were, the Semitic way of doing theology, thus seems to be the polar opposite of Enlightenment valorizations, framed against a certain image of Christianity, of both body and mind. Although rejecting an obsession with guilt and sin and eremiticism, the Enlightenment revalorized the body, but this did not take place through a ressourcement in the despised Semitism. The 18th century philosopher didn't go back to Jewish law, but through a very different return to what might be described as essentially pagan classical conceptions. Unlike the Semites, the philosophe ended up not knowing really what to do with the body other than heal it or make it stronger. Return to classical ideas and the beginning of the cult of sport in Western Europe. The Semitisms, however, while generally rejecting the public cult of the body, had always been attuned to its functions, each of which was integrated into the human subject through complex webs of conscious intention, niyya, or in the Jewish context, KUALA, and comprehensive Sharia practice. Just fast forward to my conclusion, because I think that it would be good to hear your questions. Essentially what I've been talking about has been ways in which certain contemporary terms in Western philosophy, particularly the return to the idea of the communitarian principle, the basis from which we do philosophy, our embeddedness in a particular form or world, and also at least Foucault's lament that no longer does our form or world predicate itself upon the premise of self-abnegation, the Ghazalian turn within. But essentially I've been referring to the problem of the ego, or the selfhood of the subject. The subjectivity of the typical antithesis, this besetting sin, as Levinas would see it, of the European project, has attracted numerous criticisms, and not just from Levinas, but from people like Popper as well. The sublation seems entirely dependent on the choice of counter-argument, and hence appears as culturally determined and unfixed. A frequent plurality of antitheses, alternate or plural second readings of a scriptural text, sometimes can seem only to exacerbate the problem. It seems to be assumed that the mind can offer and select such readings in a stable way, and in general Enlightenment definitions of the human subject, once prevalent in disciplines such as Islamic studies, assume that the academic may interpret texts, and even Clifford Geertz's moods and motivations, in a fixed fashion by deploying his or her status as a learned scholar subject. This fixity is already implicitly undermined by Hegel's own vague use of sublation, which seems to imply abolition and advancement simultaneously. More recently, this ambiguity about the precision of the human subject has been sharpened, as we began to worry, in Robert Pippin's words, whether the assumption of such a free, rational, reflective, responsible individual subject is warranted. Now, this is the next step beyond postmodernism, of course, the denial of the existence of the self. First we deny the other, and hence deny the possibility of a philosophy based on relationality, and then we deny the existence of the self, which seems to be where a lot of modern neuroscience is moving. So this crisis of subjectivity has called not just theology, but all the humanities into profound question, and disciplines such as the history of philosophy and Islamic studies, historically citadels of reification based on supposedly scientific methods determined by a regnant and objective Western mind, are particularly effective. Abrahamic religions, however, usually share a belief in an afterlife preceded by physical resurrection. They thus tend to converge on a view that body and consciousness are, as we've seen, closely interrelated. The Semitisms particularly convinced that the basis of human knowledge is connected to the body, which is the foundation of the human subject, the mediator by which we know the world which also ineluctably shapes our perceptions of the world. So for one rabbi, from the physical we perceive the spiritual. In Islam, Ghazali and Sufi and Fatullah traditions have also often emphasized the body-spirit integrity, while the soul, of course in Kalam, is typically regarded as a physical thing, physically coterminous with the body. While Christianity, as we've seen, has often developed quasi-dualistic accounts of the relation, and has at times evinced skepticism over the value of the body, it has hardly neglected the partial reliance of mental states on bodily conditions. Asceticism is not the only way the body may be religiously employed. We've indicated a few minutes ago that this seems to enable a partial escape from deconstruction, seen as a neglect of the relative constancy of our embodiment. Biology is a single discipline, and pointed to sacred law as a nexus which might establish a stable connection between consciousness, defined by pietists as right intention, niyyah, or attention, hudur, and the body and its functions. Maybe even what today would popularly be referred to as mindfulness, the attempt to bring together the body, the mind, the spirit, which are three attributes of the human composite which in the conditions of late modernity seem to be flying apart in such a threatening way. And for Islam, this explains the centrality of the hadith and nawafil, the hadith text in which conscious obedience to the law ends up yielding direct knowledge of God. Thus the reality of the world is affirmed, but also its heterogeneity. Difference is real and to be affirmed. So Soloveitchik's explication of this, his idea of a legal recognition, the recognition of the divine through our intersubjectivity as members of a community bound together by revealed law, also provides, it seems, and again I think this is the final Ghazalian insight, the necessary beginning for a philosophical project that will not, as so many recent projects have done, collapse upon itself. Claiming to enable not only a real human intersubjectivity through my embodiment and through the connection of the body to the spirit through practices of intention and the right deployment of the body in Sharia compliance and faithfulness, a real human intersubjectivity is enabled, but also to the possibility of an intuitive transcendence and the taking of theory choices, even in the strictest forms of kalam, based on a transformed selfhood. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Jazakallah khairan, Shaykh. Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Yes, I find this very intriguing that Shaykh is mentioning how the polemic exists between the Semiticists versus the postmodernists, in a sense, by highlighting the weaknesses of the Enlightenment thoughts, if I get that right. We open the hall for more questions. Two questions, one from the female side and one from the male side. Tafaddal. Yes, one over there. Please come forward.
First of all, thank you for the very informative talk. Before I ask my question, I just want to say a comment. You mentioned that about converting every dhanni to qat'i, and then after that you mentioned a book title.
You can come over here. Yeah. Ask a question here. It's connected to this one.
My question is, you mentioned about the oil and the Christianity, you have two parallel lines. One has oil, gives more attention to the body, and the other one is melatonin and gives more attention.
both important points. I think insofar as Islam, as Christianity, is heir to the late antique synthesis of Plato, Aristotle, Middle Platonism, and this impinges upon views of the body and the way in which the human subject is related to the body in its philosophical processes, overwhelmingly, despite the influence of Aristotelian forms, particularly in the falsafa world. I think that the Islamic instinct has always been more towards the Platonic, not only in aesthetics, but in the Sufi context of the body, the human form as being the shahid, that which points to the beauty that is beyond, beauty being the splendor of the truth. And certainly the Sufi tradition, and ultimately I would say the higher Ghazali, as it were, that we see, say, in the Mishkat al-Anwar, represents a deployment of an essentially Neoplatonic and I think probably anti-Aristotelian perspective. It's non-dualistic, it's unitive, it's aestheticizing in its impulses.
Thank you, Doctor, for that question, and also Sheikh for the answer. We encourage more deep questions such as those. Another one? Yes, sister, please come forward. You can come here, please. Do introduce yourself.
I'm Alwani Ghazali from University of Science Islam Malaysia. I'm interested in the point you mentioned pertaining to hermeneutics just now, and the concepts mentioned, several concepts you mentioned about regarding to Michael Bachtin, Schleiermacher, and also Heidegger. There is a view which mentioned that instead of employing hermeneutics to as a method or as a tool to treat our text and our scriptures, it is more efficiently if hermeneutics takes its role in the field of human sciences. I would like to hear your comment about that, and how do you see these instruments, hermeneutics, can play its role further in the reconstruction of Islamic studies as a whole? Thank you.
And akhlaq. But whereas in the modern Western academy, human sciences take their point of departure from an essentially Darwinian and sometimes quite mechanistic idea of human agency, in some ways quite strangely automated and even anti-humanistic in the current modality. The Islamic conception of human subjectivity is one that, as it were, reflects the light that's received from above, rather than the river out of Eden or the selfish gene, the blind watchmaker. There is a radical incompatibility between the human sciences as professed in contemporary universities and the Islamic vision of human becoming. We do not come from below, evolving upwards. We are creatures that reflect the splendor of heaven. Inna Allaha khalaqa Adama ala surati. And therefore it's a very uncomfortable exercise for Muslims to engage in hermeneutics based on an essentially militant atheistic perception, whether it be Comtean or Durkheimian or whatever, of human nature and human relationality. It's like squaring the circle. Some people have to do it in order to get jobs. It's part of the difficulty that Muslims face if they're occupying positions in modern humanities faculties. We have to, as it were, be quite heavily veiled and try to use a language that ultimately we're not theologically committed to. But as those sciences, as the basis for a legal or a theological or scriptural hermeneutic, I would say have no intrinsic validity, because they're based on something whose tahaffut can be shown. They're based on the Enlightenment idea of the sovereign human will, which now, with neuroscience, postmodernism, various forms of Walter Benjamin-type skepticism about human agency, have largely collapsed. That's one of the philosophical weaknesses of modernity. The Enlightenment was going to put man in place of God, hence the humanities, humanism. And now our conception of human autonomy has been eroded and eroded until you have people like Donald Wegner with his book, The Illusion of Conscious Will. We don't even have consciousness according to the new generation of the neuroscientists. And of course a lot of the physicists have a very reductionist notion of consciousness and human agency as well, which is why theology is not just experiencing a second wind in the academy, but is indispensable for the recovery of the humanities, which are in danger of collapsing ultimately just into imprecise versions of the natural sciences, which is not what they were set up to establish. They were about Geist, spirit, which Kant thought was something which was radically alternate to the physical universe. And where that opposition or that fruitful polarity is being diminished, theology has to step in, which is our mission, inshallah. Time for another question, or are we done?
Yeah, we have to limit it to 2 questions. It's already 10:06. Is it okay for you?
Yeah.
Okay, so you'd like to welcome one more question, sure. Oh, this would be the last question. Please come forward and introduce yourself.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. My name is Imran, and I'm a student from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. I'm actually trained in sociology, so my question is, it concerns, do you see it to be possible for us to marry theology with postmodernism? Because I'm interested in theories that are able to, postmodern theories as a tool, whereas the content is actually theology. For example, I see the work of Baudrillard as capable of expressing common ground with humanism. And the example would be that we experience reality as a simulation. And as an example, I think that video games can be an expression of how we can have fate and free will at the same time, because players have free will within the construct of all the outcomes have already been programmed by the creator. What are your comments on this, Sheikh?
Thank you. Of course, postmodernism doesn't have a single orthodoxy. There are ways in which its critique of the Enlightenment linear narrative can converge with a certain type of Ghazali in his Tahafut mood critique of the coherence of Aristotelian wisdom. So as a polemical instrument, it can be useful, and many theologians in the West, Catherine Pickstock, John Milbank, and others in the Christian tradition have indeed used that. Michel de Certeau, as a kind of almost postmodernist Catholic theologian. But insofar as it challenges our capacity to know anything in the exterior world that can transcend our own framing or own experience of that exterior world, it's clearly something that is what Ghazali would refer to as some kind of safsata, the denial of any possible premises or propositions about the exterior world, which clearly is not what revelation is about. Revelation delivers and presumes that it's delivering foundational truths. In the context of something like Baudrillard, others who are, particularly those who are social critics, and concerned to use the postmodern deconstruction of the triumphalist, Eurocentric, European, Aristotelian, Darwinian narrative, the white man as the culmination of a billion years of evolution. There's a certain partnership that can be found there. And somebody like Slavoj Žižek, for instance, sometimes has interesting things to say about religion, Christianity, Islam sometimes, in ways which often rub atheists up the wrong way. But he's doing it for his own purposes and is, I think, an incongruous bedfellow for most theologians.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. You are joining us tomorrow, inshallah. Yes, so do come tomorrow for more discussion. We wrap up for this first keynote speaker. Deep questions from our audience. These are the kind of questions that we should always ask. We are not fearful of questions. We can combine that Prometheus spirit of questioning with a more tempered Islamic way and manners of adab, of dealing with questions that are pertinent to our time. And inshallah, this generation is ready for that. Moving on to the second speaker, we have our Honorable Shaykh Dr. Umar FARUQ Abdullah. We have already introduced him yesterday, and we all know him very well, alhamdulillah. So his title will be Reviving the Nature and Meaning and Values, Self and Humanity. Tafaddal.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والتأدب والتأديب والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله والسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على الخير ابتغاء مرضات الله ووجهه وقربه سبحانه. اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا برحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. يا عليم علمنا من علمك ما ترضى به عنا ولا تؤاخذنا بما تعلمه منا. يا حليم خلقنا بخلق الحلم وحققنا بحقائق العلم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I'm honored to be back with you today, especially in the company of these great scholars like Sidi HAKIM MURAD, Sidi FOUDEH, and others. Yesterday, in speaking about theology, I emphasized the fact that you have to begin at the beginning. And this is one of the most important things in our theological project. And in fact, in every aspect of the intellectual civilization of Islam. You've got to get the beginnings right. You have to begin with first principles. You have to get your definitions tight. And from there, then we begin. One of the most important purposes of theology, therefore, especially at the fundamental level, is that it lays down the foundations that all of us as Muslims must agree to. And in doing that, it establishes the basic elements of our perception of reality as it actually is. And this project is, of course, focused on what is qat'i, what is unambiguous in revelation and in intellect, and then also in what we know from customary experience. So with this we lay the foundation. And it's very important that we understand that this foundation is not the building. It is what underlies the civilization. Imam al-Ghazali is always telling us in his Ihya Ulumuddin about ilm al-mu'amala, this foundational knowledge that enables us to carry out the transaction between ourselves, and between ourselves and others, and between ourselves and God, and between ourselves and the creation of God that He's made around us. And always He's telling us that this knowledge will bring you to the door of ilm al-mukashafa, which is the knowledge of the unveiling of the profound realities that underlie all creation and that give us the true meaning and the fullest meaning of life and what is real. And this is also one of the great purposes of theology. It is to lay down for us the foundations by which we expand and by which we grow, and by which we are able to give reality a voice in our civilization, and to arrive at this knowledge of ultimate realities. And those ultimate realities we can call metaphysics. Metaphysics is the science of haqa'iq, the science of the ultimate realities that underlie creation. And this is something that is beyond the scope of most human beings. It's something that they cannot fathom on their own. In fact, even if we speak about it discursively, it would be something that most people do not understand. But theology lays the foundation for that also. And metaphysics is as important in the project of civilization as these foundational elements are. Each one has to be in its own place. And just as Kalam, discursive theology, has the purpose of defending the religion at a very fundamental level and establishing what must be believed and rejecting what must not be believed. So also metaphysics, as it grows into this great palace of light, it also is essentially there to defend the religion. And it is also necessary. And we ultimately have to go through that door of mukashafa. We don't all go through that, but in the society, we could even say it's a fard kifaya, that we have great men and women who are illuminated by that ilm al-mukashafa, and then can give us the answers to all things. If we look at the great masters of Islamic civilization, many of whom we know, like a Shaykh al-Akbar, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, God be pleased with him, and many of whom are regional. Here in Nusantara you have many great people like that, for example. These people stand on the solid foundations of what is qat'i in this religion. Ibn Arabi, in his book, Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, in the first part of that book, gives us his aqeedah. And that aqeedah is a standard aqeedah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And one of the reasons that he does that is to emphasize that even though you may not realize that, I am standing on this foundation. And if you understand anything that I say to be in contradiction to that, then I don't agree. That everything I do is in answer to that. And out of this comes that huge structure, which is not philosophy, not in his case, it is illumination. It is mukashafa. But in that, you have an answer to everything. And this is also absolutely essential in any religion and in any religious civilization. The metaphysics has also got to be there. If we look in the Kalam tradition, which is again foundational and absolutely essential, and of course our Kalam tradition also grows through history, and it engages in a discourse with the metaphysics and with the philosophy and other things. It goes through different stages. But the Kalam often will give us very basic answers to things. So, for example, if we talk about good and evil, or we talk about heaven and hell, we may find that the discourse in Kalam is not as rich as we would like it to be. Again, because it's very fundamental, and it's based on what is known to be necessary, possible, and impossible. It is not the whole answer. Whereas if we go into the palace of the metaphysics, there we have profound answers to all of these things. For example, that the nature of evil is privation, and that evil is essentially a psychotic phenomenon that exists in the nafs, the psyche, and it's real in the world at large, but it's not rooted in the way that truth is rooted. And even if we talk about heaven and hell, then we talk about identity and other things like that. So this is something that I would like to talk about today. That in the reviving of the meaning of values and self and humanity, we have to have the whole structure. And this has got to be the vision that we seek to bring about. The teaching of sound theology. And again, in conjunction with or juxtaposition to those paradigms and cognitive frames that are common in the thought of our age, among postmodernists, among modernists, and among others. But then we have to rebuild the palace of the lights. And here, this is something very important in Islamic civilization. Because what is the language of the metaphysics? How do we communicate that to our society? How do we build that palace of lights? This is what you had in earlier times in the great civilizations of Islam in Spain and Portugal and North Africa, West Africa, in Nusantara, in Central Asia and elsewhere. Primarily that's built by art and architecture. And the reason for this is that most of those discursive truths that the metaphysics talks about and that it elaborates, that we have in people like Sadruddin al-Qunawi, who's one of the great metaphysicians. These are things that very few people can understand. And they take perhaps even a lifetime of devotion to be able to master correctly. But there are those people that can do that, just as in the modern world, not everyone can master quantum physics or other precise sciences in technology and so forth. You've got to have people who do that. But in our tradition, we had people like that. They master these things amazingly. But then the person who draws that picture, that makes it clear to the society at large, this is the artist, this is the poet, this is the architect. And as Sidi Abdul Hakim noted, beauty is the splendor of truth. This is a Platonic aphorism, a Platonic truth, but it is real. Beauty is the splendor of truth. When you have the truth, and when you articulate the truth in the most comprehensive way that can be, with the foundational knowledge and then also with the knowledge that comes from mukashafa and spiritual enlightenment, which is the fruit of the tree, then that truth transforms you. It overtakes you. And this is part of what we can understand from the previous speech about the necessity of overcoming the ego and disciplining the self. Okay, so that truth then becomes your internal quality. And that truth, when it takes you over and transforms you, it makes you internally beautiful. Truth is beauty. God is beautiful. And He loves beauty. And traditionally we understood that to mean also by mafhum al-mukhalafa, by the understanding that you get, which is unspoken but contrary, that God does not love what is ugly. And Islamic civilizations were extremely beautiful. They take on different forms wherever they appear. Even in the same region, you'll see that every ethnic group that comes into Islam will have its own unique formulas for beauty. And they all come together wonderfully, but each of them is unique. Beauty takes on infinite varieties, but not everything is beautiful. So you get the truth. And again, the truth here is not just the foundational truth, which is always there. It's got to be the basis. But it's also that elaboration of reality that gives reality a voice in the world. And that transforms you inwardly. And it makes you beautiful. And what do we call that beauty? We call it virtue. Virtue. Good character. We call it balance. Adl and ABDAL. Getting everything in the right place. Giving everything its due. It's grace. And when we have that truth, then we manifest it in everything that we do. And so beauty becomes the way we live. Beauty becomes the way we speak to each other, the courtesies we have, the houses we build, the gardens that we have, and so forth. Beauty is therefore the hallmark of truth. Just as ugliness is the mark of evil, ugliness is the mark of the loss of truth. So this is very important to understand, again, how to make our societies beautiful, how to revive the arts and architecture and other expressions of beauty so they do that. Because beauty speaks to the people. Beauty is attractive. Beauty tells us what we cannot express discursively. So it is an essential medium of taking people to those truths. And this is why traditional Islamic societies place such a high value on beauty. So we live today in a highly anti-metaphysical age. And the development of Western civilization over the last 500 years has been a process of the destruction of the metaphysics that it once had. And today our science, our ethics, our values, everything are without metaphysics. They are anti-metaphysical. We Muslims also are the most anti-metaphysical that we've ever been in history. In the past, we understood these things, and we cherished them, and we cultivated them. Today, on the contrary, because perhaps of the way that we have been drawn into modern civilization, and we've taken on mindsets that are actually foreign to ourselves, then we no longer have this understanding. We no longer have this conviction. In fact, we can be said to be as anti-metaphysical as anyone. But this is something that has to be revived. This is something that has to be revived. The religion has got to be able to answer all of your questions. And also it's got to do that in a way that's beautiful. And in a way that creates for you an environment that is welcoming and harmonious, in which you are at home. And when we can't do that, when there is no metaphysics in religion, there are no answers to the big questions, then the response of that is a type of sclerosis that ultimately will destroy the religion itself. So that in the destruction of the metaphysics and the great understanding of the religion that comes with that, you have a number of typical responses. One of those is the complete rejection of religion. And of course we see that a lot today. And you see it usually among the most intelligent and the most gifted. Historically, we were able to keep the most intelligent among us and the most gifted, not just in the religion, but at the very core of the religion. And they become the most enthusiastic builders of Islamic thought and of Islamic civilization. And why is that so? Because they know that we have an answer to everything. And that this religion is true. That it's not just assertions. It is not just commands and prohibitions. It is not just externalities. But it is the fullest expression of truth. And you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And you can go higher and higher and higher. And we express that in our poetry. We express that in our music. We express that in our architecture. We express that in our art and everything that we do. And all of this is like a symphony that instructs the entirety of the society and raises all the people together. Both those who can understand these things and those who cannot. Whenever that goes, then you are going to lose the best among us. Isn't this a crisis that we face today? We see it over and over again. Many of our scholars today cannot answer the questions. They cannot respond to the challenges of secularism. They cannot address the most important issues of the time. And this failure has got to be addressed, and it's got to be taken care of. We've got to do that. If you don't have metaphysics, if you don't have this foundation, and then the beautiful palace that comes on top of it, you will lose the very best among you. And we can't afford to do that. And another response that you will get out of that is the response of extremism. And these are the people who don't have answers, and they don't have understanding, but they do have a commitment to the fact that they believe that this religion is true. And their fanaticism, actually their extremism, is an expression of their psychological vulnerability, because they don't have answers. But they will hold to it anyway. They will take the action that they feel is necessary. And in this process, they destroy what remains of the edifice. So you have these two extremes. One of them is just check out. Leave the religion altogether. Either have no religion, maybe you could find a better one on the market. Maybe you could find a philosophy of chakras or something like that that will make life meaningful to you. And the other one is the extremist response, which is perhaps even more dangerous. And perhaps in between that you have people, who are neither way, maybe out of politeness to their tradition, politeness to their elders and parents. They will continue to hold to the religion in some formal way. But even they don't have the commitment that is needed. And if we look at our Muslim communities today, we find that complacency is a very typical characteristic of many Muslims. It's a type of complacency that, it's like, it's not commitment on the one hand, it's not understanding on the other, but then they don't check out either. But they're sort of in this lukewarm state. And these are diseases of the soul. And we have got to deal with that. And again, we've got to have a vision. We've got to respond to the challenges that are there before us. And we've got to address the intellectual universe that we live in. But you have to address it by going to first principles. You've got to go back to the beginning. And if you look into the thought of different thinkers, they all become rigorous at a certain point, otherwise they wouldn't be read. But you cannot really benefit from their thought if you don't take it back to the beginning and see where they got things right and where they got things wrong. So we have to have a vision. We've got to put together that vision. And in doing that, we have this rich tradition of theology, of law, of jurisprudence, of maxims, maqasid. We've got this traditional wealth of theological discourse at different planes of the intellect. And then, of course, we've got that palace of lights that was built by the greatest of us of all, the Arifin, the Arifat, these people who come to know God and are given the fruits of that. And they express it usually in beauty, like Jalaluddin Rumi and others, Hafiz, the great poets of the Arab world and of the non-Arab world. I know of a man who once went to visit a particular place in Pakistan, and he stayed there at this particular place, until late at night, and then he had to go back to his hotel, and a Pakistani, cart driver came to pick him up with his horse and his open cart. They call that something special in Urdu, which I don't remember. And this man spoke Persian, but he didn't speak Urdu. The other man spoke Urdu, he didn't speak Persian. But he told him, I want you to take me to the hotels such and such. And so he said, get in. And amazingly, this driver of the cart, who was a poor man, he said if you looked at his clothing, you could go and buy it in the market for a couple of dollars. He's a very poor man. But all the way back to his hotel, over a period of maybe 45 minutes or an hour, this driver began to recite to him from Hafiz and Rumi. So he'd memorized this in Persian. He said, I learned more metaphysics in that single night, in that single ride, than I learned in 30 years of study. Okay, and what's the point? Again, the point is that beauty is what speaks this most eloquently. And beauty is the splendor of truth. It is the language of truth. And that is what made our civilization love beauty and cultivate beauty in everything we did. In the clothes we wore, in the dishes we ate on, or the leaves of the plants that we ate on, in the way we prepared our food, in the houses we built, in the wood carvings that we made, and in everything we did. And that is a fundamental part of Islam. Beauty is absolutely essential to Islam. And then it speaks this language that no one else can speak. And it cultivates a society that can grow into that beauty and that can synthesize that beauty within itself. Islamic societies were extremely skilled. And it's very important for us to study the way our societies were. The Muslim city was a garden city. It produced all the food that it needed to eat, even though it imported. But legally, it had to be self-sufficient. And the labor in that city was skilled labor, usually labor that's based in guilds. And those guilds were often spiritual orders, in which metaphysics was very important. In the wood carvings that you have in Nusantara, all of these begin in a particular center, which is a sign of the Creator and creation, and they work out in a particular way, and they radiate up towards the truth and heaven. All of that was very conscious. And again, it's a way of manifesting this reality that we believe in every form of the world around us, to give reality a voice. So these are things that we need to aspire for. And I'd like to come back to where we ended yesterday, and that's the fact that human beings are, by their nature, incurably religious. Their responses to things are going to be invariably religious. We are homo religiosus. We are the religious animal, man. And when we get good religion, we are good. You know, we become human. As Imam al-Ghazali said, if it were not for the scholars who embody true religion, human beings would become animals. They would become less than human. We have to give that back to them. Al-ulama surujul azmina. The scholars are the radiant lights of the times, men and women scholars. Each of them is the lamp that radiates in their age. So we have to begin to put together that vision again. We have to begin to live that again. And in this, we are meeting the greatest need of humanity today. Because humanity today, having been put all together in the same boat, are undergoing religious crises that are the greatest they have ever undergone. As we mentioned yesterday, you have a new religious movement born every 12 hours. A new religious movement, 2, born every day. Usually they are identity religion. They have very small groups, and they are based on the idea that I am right and everyone else is wrong. They have in them this element of narcissism and ego and rejection of the other. But nevertheless, even they, in their very great limitations, reflect this profound need that we have to be religious. The 20th century is the most secular of all ages that we know in history. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, the fascist phenomenons of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, and so forth. But even these were secular alternatives to religion. And even these reflect the fact that human beings in that 20th century, which is not that radically different from our own, they too are seeking for a solution. They're seeking for a meaning. And you are the ones, we are the ones who can do that in such a way that bring all human beings together. Of course, we bring together those who agree with us, who accept the fundamentals. That will be the ummah. Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. You are the best community brought forth for humankind. The best of all people to all people. That's how the Salaf understood that. You must be the best of all people to all people. And then we have those who don't agree with us. They don't accept the fundamentals. And historically, we have the gift of living with them, not just with toleration, even with protection, even encouraging them to be better at what they do. So this is the priceless gift. This is the essential need of humanity today to be able to continue to exist and to go forward. You can bring clarity out of this confusion. You can give humanity its humanity back. But to do that, you've got to be transformed by the truth itself. Yourself. You've got to imbibe it. You've got to become beautiful. Then you can produce that beauty, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And we can offer to humanity this gift which they need very much. And this requires, again, bringing back also the metaphysics. Without that, there's no value. Without that, there's no evaluation. Without that, there's no understanding of reality. and there's no understanding of ourselves either. May you be successful in these days. I apologize for the fact that I come and run. I should be here listening to all your discourse. That no doubt creates a certain incoherence. I personally don't like going about things that way. Unfortunately, I have other commitments that I have to keep, so I ask you to excuse me. But I hope that in these days, being with these great scholars, men and women who are presenting to you, that we will find the clarity that we need. And inshallah, we'll be able to go forward. And we'll be able to bring back civilization to this part of the world and to other parts of the world, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and to show the world Islam with its beautiful face, its real face. That which is ugly cannot be true. That which is ugly carries the mark of the Antichrist. It carries the mark of falsehood. We know these things intuitively. We know them also metaphysically. We've got to get back our beauty, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And this has got to be the means by which we speak to humanity. Beauty. This is our weapon. A weapon that you know very well in your past. When Islam was spread in Java, it wasn't spread by swords or spears, was it? It was spread by puppets, Kali Jaga. And the puppets told the story of the metaphysics, and it articulated that against the background of a Hindu-Buddhist tradition that was extremely rich and extremely metaphysical. And then it was able to articulate a new metaphysics that didn't contradict that one, but that was able to flush it out and to fill it out and to make it meaningful. So this is the kind of thing that we need to do, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. May we be successful at that. Wassalamu alaikum.
Introduce yourself, please.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Great civilization always manifests beauty.
They manufacture beauty, yes.
So I read somewhere, one of Nakib Al-Auta's books, he said that sometimes beauty is not the mark of a great civilization. Sometimes beauty is the mark, the degeneration, degeneration of a civilization.
Such as?
Such as Babylon.
Such as Babylon?
Yeah, Pharaoh's nation. The Greeks, they have beautiful buildings, Petra, and yet that marks the degradation of their morality, the degeneration of their morality. Yeah. So, how's that? How would I relate that?
How are we against that?
How can I relate when beauty is the mark of great civilizations, and sometimes beauty shows how morality is in decline?
That's a complex issue, and that's something that has many aspects to it. Often the beauty that is produced by great civilization, it's the thing that continues on even after the root has been cut. And therefore, a civilization can go into decline, but it still has a structure of that ornamentation, of that beauty that it had. And this is one of the reasons why, historically, when Islam spread, it always took very seriously the creations of beauty that the people that it engaged had cultivated. So when Islam comes to China over 1,400 years ago, The Chinese Muslims will say that Islam came to China and the legacy of the Yellow Emperor was not dead. Some of it was still there. And the Muslims plug into that and they renew it and they bring it back to life. Was that still functioning? And we don't really know who the Yellow Emperor was, who lived thousands of years ago. I would be inclined to believe that he was a prophetic figure. Because usually the kind of things that are done by people like the legendary Yellow Emperor, or even the legendary founders of Egyptian civilization or Babylonian civilization, those are the kinds of transformations that we expect from a prophet and from a prophetic creative minority. But wherever we go in the world, we will find elements of the truth that was there, that is usually echoed in the beauty that is left. And so therefore we would adopt that. Islam goes into China and it adopts these different modes of Confucianist, Neo-Confucianist, Pure Land Buddhist, Taoist architecture and art, but they're not Neo-Confucianists anymore, or Taoist or Buddhist. They are now Islamic expressions of beauty. And we had great Chinese thinkers like Wan Daiju and Liu Ji, who articulated Islam to the Muslims of China, who themselves were educated in the classics, but who made sense of it in terms of the great traditions of the Chinese past. In Nusantara, you accept, for example, the sacred mountain, which is this basic architectural structure that all of you know very well. The three-tiered roof, and the four poles that represent the four directions of the universe. And then you have the first roof, and the second roof, and the third, a type of architecture which was sacred, and we adopted it very wisely as our standard mosque architecture. In the colonial period, that will be essentially removed. The English, for example, will want us to do real Islamic architecture. You need to have a dome. You need to have Moorish designs. You don't have to have a dome. That's nonsense. You know, what you had before was sacred just as the dome was sacred in its particular cultural context, or just as the Moorish motifs were sacred in their context. Al-'ada muhakkama, good local customs and conventions have the power of the sunnah. They have the power of the law. They are not bid'ah. We honor them. And in honoring them, and we say also, tarkul 'ada adawa, that if you abandon the good conventions of your people, these remnants of beauty, for example, that they have, that's an act of aggression. That is culturally predatory. So we don't do that. And also these traditions of the Zen Buddhists or the Neo-Confucianists or other religious communities, they're also based at some point in some element of prophetic truth in the past. So we affirm them. The Ottomans ruled Greece for many centuries. And the Greeks loved the Ottomans. And the Orthodox Church in particular had a very strong relationship with the Ottomans. The Ottomans brought it to life. They reformed it. They protected it. The Armenian Church as well. This is what we're supposed to do. The Catholic Church as well. The Ottomans had beautiful mandates in their empire, demanding that Franciscans and Benedictines and other types of Catholic monastic orders not only be protected, but be respected. So we have that. When the Ottomans went to Athens, Greece, which they ruled for centuries, where did you pray Salat al-Jumu'ah? Where is the great Jami' Mosque of Athens? It was the Parthenon. The Parthenon, one of the most beautiful structures that human beings ever made. Arnold Toynbee says that the Parthenon and the Blue Mosque of Istanbul are the architectural apex of human achievement. The Ottomans took the Parthenon, which was not destroyed in those days, by the way. It was intact. It will be destroyed by Greek revolutionaries in the 19th century, Greek nationalists. Okay? But again, you see here, this is an extremely beautiful building. Now, what does it reflect about ancient Athens and about its decadence or lack of decadence? That's a historical question I can't answer. But it is beautiful. And the beauty that it reflects is also an emblem of truth. So the Ottomans took it and they made it a beautiful mosque. And in that they honored the Greek tradition, and amazingly also in that they did not offend the sensibilities of the Orthodox Church, because the Orthodox Church didn't care about pagan antiquities. So when we find beauty, we take it seriously. Whether that beauty reflects decadence or not, however, if we were to study the history of Western architecture and art, it's very interesting how it destroys the very principles of truth that had once informed it. In any case, let's take another question. And I ask your pardon if I didn't answer your question as well as you would have liked.
Yes, brother, please proceed. Introduce yourself, please.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Abdul Halim from IIUM. My question is, since the postmodernism actually rejects the some kind of authority, especially I want to emphasize in authority in using the language. So because they reject how we should use the language to convey something. And then the question is how we want to convey the elements of metaphysics among the youngsters, since they are not using the language correctly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We live in the reign of the plastic word. We talked about this yesterday a little bit. Words that have hundreds of connotations and no denotation at all. And one of the things we want to do is to bring back the denotations. That's not actually difficult to do. You can just open up your dictionary and you can go to the etymology of the words, because the etymologies of the words we use in English or in French or in Malay, you have a beautiful linguistic tradition, rich classical words. These words are filled with meaning. And often that meaning is profoundly metaphysical. The Arabic language is one of the greatest of all. And of course, we never neglect that in Islamic civilization. The Arabic language will always be there in its place of honor, next to whatever other language you speak, whether it's Malay, or whether it's Turkish, or whether it's Mandinka, or whatever it may be. One of the amazing things about the Arabic language, it's extremely old. In its family, which is called the Hamitic, Hamitic family. Today we call it Afro-Asian. It includes Babylonian, Assyrian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Thamudic, which is a language. We know that language that Thamud spoke. It includes the language of Pharaoh in ancient Egypt, Berber, Coptic, many other languages. But in this family, linguists, they compare things and they figure out what was the oldest form of this language like that all these other forms came from. And it's not such a difficult thing to do, because you see where are the elements that are held in common and the elements that are lost. And when we do that with Arabic, it comes out to be the oldest level of all, even older than Babylonian, older than Iblite, which is another language of the ancient Middle East, much older than Pharaonic Egyptian. And go to a dictionary, let's say Lisan al-Arab, this incredible dictionary which has in it virtually no words, no definitions that are beyond those of pre-Islamic Arabia and those of the Quran and the Hadith and that first generation. There are no new words there. because they don't do that. This is the foundational language. And then look at the meanings of the words in terms of their roots. Like, this is metaphysics. These are languages, Arabic, and I would say all ancient languages, that are perfectly attuned to the structure of reality and that enable us to speak very precisely. So for us, the renewal of language is absolutely essential. And again, we must respect the postmodernist project. We must also know what is its senate, especially its relationship to Marxism. And its deconstruction is essentially a Marxist method. And, as one of our questioners said, there are things we can use it for, but you have to be very careful. When you begin to adopt the language of postmodernism, you are adopting the cognitive frames of postmodernism. Are you sure that fits? Are you sure that that works? Because you don't have to do that. And in many ways, my suggestion is cut the Gordian knot. You don't have to study about string theory. It's nonsense. You have no metaphysics in modern physics. So let's go back to the beginning. We can talk about the applications. We can see what we can do. But really, these things have to be rethought. And we do engage. We have to engage. But again, we should engage very intelligently. Let's go back to the beginning. How did you begin? How did you start? Did you get that right? Did you get that wrong? So the renewal of language is very important. And your Malay language, you should really give a lot of attention to the study of Malay, of classical Malay. Don't think that this is out of date. This is something that you'll find great light in, great benefit in. And then also, if we look at people like the Shaykh al-Akbar, he's got an answer for everything. As much as you learn what he has to say, he'll always be way above you. And there are many people like that in Islamic tradition. But one of the things which is really beautiful about him, based on his understanding of the names of God, and the way that those names of God manifest themselves in creation, in tajalliyat, is this doctrine of the fact that there are many relative truths. And when he speaks about that, it's almost as if it were a postmodernist. There are many relative truths, but he will add, they are not equally true, nor are they equally felicitous. And therefore, there is an absolute truth, which is embodied in Al-Haq, God the real, with all of his beautiful names, and which is also embodied in Al-Insan al-Kamil, in the perfect human being, manifested in people like our blessed Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Ulul Azmi min al-Rusul, and the other great prophets and saints. And these people are magnanimous. They are people who are of great spirit. And therefore they can understand everything. They can relate to all human beings. They can relate to all civilizations. They can be empathetic with everything in the whole panorama of human experience. This is a treasure. And again, it's remarkably relevant to us in our age of postmodernism. But I suggest, we have got to start our project. We've got to get our vision. And this would begin with sound theology. But that theology has got to be articulated carefully in juxtaposition to the thought universe that we live in today. If I could just say one more thing. I'm very impolite, but I became a Muslim in 1970. January the 2nd, 1970. I was a student of history. I was a student of literature. And I loved literature very much. And I loved the English language. And one of the things that really weighed on my heart was the death of poetry. And if you study modern English literature, you'll know that James Joyce, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Gerald Manley Hopkins, and others are very concerned with that issue, that what happened to us, we became straw men, we became hollow men. The poetry of the past means nothing to us anymore. We can't even produce it, and if we do, nobody will listen to it. And when God blessed me with this beautiful religion, one of the things that I felt is that if Islam spreads among my people, the English speakers, English will come back to life, and poetry will come back to life. And we have with us here in Malaysia right now, Baraka Blue. I wish you were on stage with me. I wish you could listen to him and not to me. But he's an example of that. Beautiful poetry. Also, poetry you can understand. Poetry that is profound, but simple. And we have other brothers and sisters today that are doing this. You also in Malaysia have the same thing. But when Islam is revived, the verbal, the linguistic aspect of us and our cultures, it will also be revived. And poetry, we are the poets wherever we go. And we can say in poetry what you cannot say any other way. One of the things Rumi says is that if nature had tongues, it would reveal all the secrets of God. So, may we bring this back to life. Humanity needs that desperately today. Humanity needs that desperately today. And we don't say that triumphalist, in a triumphalist way. At least I hope I don't say that in a triumphalist way. That we need to get our house back together. We need to revive ourselves. We've got these diseases of complacency, extremism, and then people just checking out altogether. I want nothing to do with this faith. All of that to me is the death of truth and the death of metaphysics. So we need to bring that back, and this will serve us well, and it will make us solutions and not problems. But also, whenever Islam flourishes historically, the other religious communities living with us as neighbors or under our protection, and we protected them, and we allowed them to flourish. We had no jealousy against them. They will also flourish, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and for me that's good for the human family. I believe we have the truth, but I thank God that that doesn't make me a bigot, and it doesn't make me a person who can't welcome goodness wherever it shows its beautiful face. I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
Sheikh, so let me introduce the third questioner. He's a student of Professor Syed Muhammad Nakib Al-Attas through the protege of Prof. Al-Attas, which is Professor Wan Muhammad Noor Wan Daud in KSIS UTM. Shafiq, also a fellow at IKIM.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kliks. Just two corrections. I wouldn't consider myself a student at Nakib Al-Attas. I'm a student from someone who is a student at Nakib Al-Attas. And I'm not a fellow, I'm a senior research officer with a junior position. Thank you, Mr. Kliks. Thank you, Dr. Umar. Just two brief questions. I appreciate how you call for the urgency of restoring metaphysics of Islam to resolve many of the problems that we have today. I'm just wondering, what would you consider the term to explain this process of reviving the metaphysics or restoring metaphysics? Like in the past, in the Malay world, you give the example of Wali Songo, for instance. Wali Songo. Some scholars call it Islamization. Now, this Islamization is not the mechanical sense, like that we see in the modern context today, which has correctly been mentioned by Brother Sohail, has reached a dead end. But it's a more natural kind of Islamization, which I feel may need to be restored in its proper place. Secondly, where do you see this project of restoring our vision? Where do you see the locus is the locus? Wouldn't you say that there's the higher education, the university? Considering the fact that now we have all other universities are countering or reversing our understanding of this metaphysics. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I understand. Maybe you can stay there. I'm not sure that I understand exactly what you're saying.
On this question of reviving the metaphysics, of course this has happened in the past. through our luminaries that you mentioned. Now, and of course, and you mentioned that it was educated, disseminated, transmitted to the people of their time. What do you call this process? Wouldn't you call it Islamization? You know, because Islamization is not meant to Islamize something. I mean, this happened right from the beginning of Islam.
Maybe the word Islamicization is a word that we might be careful about using, because it's been interpreted in very different ways. And there were references to that yesterday, maybe not the most favorable references, and I don't want to get into that, but one thing for sure, we can't just take the legacy of learning that we have today in secular universities and put an Islamic label on it and believe that it will now produce what it didn't produce before. You've got to go back to the beginning. And in history, sociology, anthropology, all of these things have got to be rethought. And their reductionism has got to be removed. They've got to expand. Sociology is very much created to destroy metaphysics. The science of modern sociology, and you have sociologists here, and our brother studied sociology. Sociology and social psychology can do great good, no question about that. And there's no question that the people do great statistical studies and they come up with important insights. But sociology as such was a secular discipline. Henri Bergson, Henry Bergson, established to deconstruct metaphysics. And all the problems we have with language and the deconstruction of language and postmodernism, maybe I shouldn't say all, that's a dangerous word, but a lot of them go back to sociology. And the reduction of language to simply a sociological transaction that has no root in truth itself. So we've got to rethink these things. Symbols, archetypes, our art in that, our architecture, our productions, and those of other traditional peoples. They're filled with symbols and archetypes. The spider's web, a sign of creation. And our psychology would tell us that, well, that actually comes from deep down in here. That's Sigmund Freud. It's sort of, maybe it's one of the things that's irrational about us. Okay, we say, no, we don't accept that at all. Symbolism is from way up there, and it is truth, and it is celestial and terrestrial. Traditional peoples understood that just like that. So, how do we bring back the vision? I think that when we get the truth, may God give it to us, and we embody this truth, and God gives us eyes with which to see and ears with which to hear, it won't be as difficult as you may think. One of the great things we know in our spiritual legacy is the way that the Arifin and the Arifat could hear reality speak. And I'll give you a story from Egypt which I happen to like a lot. And I hope this will be meaningful for you, and meaningful in answering that question. But there was a great wali of Allah there whose name was Ash-Shibli. And a peasant woman came to him with a profound existential question. And she harvests the wheat, and the wheat's full of worms. That's the way it used to be, brothers and sisters, before we had GMO and before we had pesticides. That the worm's going to eat the wheat with you, and let him have his part. You'll have something to eat too. And I remember I used to harvest wheat. I come from western Nebraska, western Kansas. We're veterinarians and farm people. We like to get our hands in the earth. And I've harvested wheat and branded cattle and herded cattle. I wore a cowboy hat. I was proud of that. Where did cowboy hats come from, by the way? Here's an Australian. You've got cowboy hats, I think. Where does the cowboy hat come from? Muslim Spain. All of our cowboy culture comes out of the Moorish culture and the Castilian culture of Muslim Spain and Portugal. George Bush didn't know about that, and neither did I. We were cowboys, but we'd harvest the wheat and it was full of worms. They're all wiggly little worms everywhere. And that's the way it used to be. And then she would harvest the fool, which are the big fava beans, which, are so nutritious and so beneficial, but they're much bigger. They have worms in them too. And she would see that. But then she noticed that when they ground the wheat, no worms remain. They all get ground. You get to eat them. Good nutrition. And when you grind the fool, some of the worms remain. Big existential question. And she said, who will answer this question for me? And maybe as sort of a joke, they directed her to Shibli, this great arif. So what did he say? من صحب الكبار سلم. من صحب الكبار سلم. Whoever keeps the company of the big ones, the great ones, will be safe. And of course it's funny, isn't it? And it's humorous. And maybe he smiled when he said it, but he didn't say that as a joke. Because he saw that in that very simple fact of the worm and the grinder, that there is a metaphysical truth that manifests itself in the world of spiritual education by your associating yourself with the greatest teachers you can find. And you want to be in their hearts, just like that fool worm was in the belly of the fool bee. And maybe he doesn't get crushed. So the Arifin, they have this ability to look at reality and to see what is actually there or what's supposed to be there and to be able to reconstruct it. And this is my understanding of the great Kali Jaga and the great Wali Songo. These were incredible human beings. And especially Kali Jaga, he's had my heart from the time that I learned about him. It's like, wow, this is it. He was a builder of civilization. And he took interpretive control. And I believe that there's nothing arbitrary about Kali Jaga. He would take colors and numbers and triads and dichotomies that are so rich and meaningful in the Hindu-Buddhist tradition, which is also a tradition that we don't scrap. They weren't wrong about everything. They were right about many things. So he's able to see that, but then he redefines it so that whenever you see two, like two strings of the gamelan, or you see the two banyan trees, it's La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And then he articulated that to the Javanese peasants in a really beautiful way. They learned Islam from puppets. That's not a bad thing to have a movie about today. And so we look at the reality and we reinterpret it. And by doing that, we enable it to grow and to become something new. And I think that in your country, which I admire honestly and sincerely very much, and of course we have lots of Australians here, I admire you too. I hope to get down your way before too long. When I'm here, they say it's just 4 hours to Perth, 8 hours to Sydney. It's like crossing the Atlantic Ocean, but it's not that far for me. But, I think even in your city, you are people who are beautiful. You are people who love beauty. And you're people who are very neat and very polite. And I see even in your city, which I regard to be a beautiful city, that you're trying to get the beauty there. You're trying to articulate the beauty. And may we do that more and more. And fiqh is about beauty. Islamic aesthetics is about beauty. The theology is about beauty. May we wake up to that. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. continue with our program. I would assume that most of us who are students here and myself, we are like the peasants. We are like the peasants who are trying to accompany the Sahibul Kibar. As an extension of that, suggestions, not only by being in such a program, we can be selective. We can be selective in the lectures that we attend. We can be selective and pick the ones that will offer something that will heighten our intellectuality, our spirituality, and not just any other, whoever that offers themselves to be heard. We can be selective in our social media. We can, unfortunately, if you have too many friends on social media, you might have to unfriend them. Maybe it's about time to unfriend those who cause you heartaches, or and subscribe only to those who have big things to share with you. Inshallah, this would be our something that we can strive to do to improve ourselves in the future. I have a bit of a sad news to convey for the next lecture that is entitled Reviving Traditional Knowledge and Sciences vis-a-vis Contemporary Knowledge by our Honorable Sheikh Dr. FOUDEH from Jordan. An accident happened in his family in the hotel room. Please pray that his child is okay. He's at he's receiving medical attention. Inshallah, it's not serious. Therefore, we are skipping this section and we are moving on to the next one. And we have a 10 minutes hiatus while our team prepare the stage. Please be patient with us. I'd like to add a few words. It's very admirable that we have a question about our own local philosopher, theologian, Professor Syed Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas. We are very fortunate to have him in this region. He has been sharing his thoughts and ideas for many, many years. He is born in Bogor, Java, and he is the son of the soil in Johor. His family is from Johor, and despite being a local, he's also very well versed with knowledge tradition from all over the world due to his aristocratic upbringing. When we approach the work of Syed Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas, it is a very how do I say, complex reading, and many scholars, such as Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hansen has said that it takes him many repeated reading in order to get various points. So it is very advisable to approach some of our scholars here. We have them in this hall, such as Dr. Wan Suhaimi in the front row, and we have many, most of other organizers of this program as well. They are students of Prof. Al-Attas from certain groups. We have a lot of personnel, important personnel from such organizers as INSIS, ISI, IKIM, and they are here today for your questions. As I was saying, for example, if you read the pinnacle work of Syed Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas, Islam and Secularism, there will be not as many footnotes as you would expect, because if there was a footnote, the footnote would essentially mean that you spend 10 hours more in the library. The kind of reading and understanding that you have to get from the work of Al-Attas is that you have to dig back into Greek philosophy, into Persian works, and many others. So it is advisable to join some programs that are offered in this country by the scholars and students of Professor Syed Naqib Al-Attas, such as at KSIS UTM, the Center for Advanced Studies on Islam, Science and Civilization. I myself am doing my PhD there and has caused a lot of headache in my life for 5 years.
no light at the end of the tunnel. Okay,